the trumpet of the Lord shall sound, and time shall be no more, and the morning breaks eternal, bright and fair. When the saved of earth shall gather over on the other shore, and the roll is called up yonder, I'll be there. When the roll is called up yonder, I'll be there. When the roll is called up yonder, I'll be there. When the roll is called up yonder, when the roll is called up yonder.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Table of Peter podcast, brought to you by Trinity United Methodist Church, located at 409 North Wilson Street, Paris, Tennessee. I am your host, Christopher At-Large, member of the board. With me, as per the norm, on the second mic, the other microphone, the more important microphone, Pastor Emily, the Rabbi Walker. What's up, Pastor Emily?
Hey, happy Monday, Chris.
How was the weekend, the week?
Great. I think I think Sunday just really I needed that time of worship that we were able to come together. I've been so focused on school, and it's my finals week, and so just to really kind of have some set aside time that whatever I was stressing about, I didn't think about it, and so I just was able to come and worship. I got to hug the grandbabies on Sunday. I mean, does it get better, right?
Well, I know Sunday I come in and another case of deja vu. It was like, am I having a stroke, or did we not just have communion last week?
Yes. I don't think you were in that boat by yourself. I mean, there was quite the commotion, Chris.
Everybody's like, why we're doing because I was really confused. It's like, didn't we just do communion? Has it already been a month? And I'm not real familiar with this. And I'm not going to lie, a lot of times I've just went through the motions without fully understanding what's going on with communion.
Yeah, well, don't we all do that in some areas? I feel like that is one thing that really resonated with me Sunday when I kept hearing all this commotion about, well, we just did communion last week, so why are we doing communion this week? And it's not the first of the month. I mean, there was just a lot of conversation. Right. But I do think maybe the more, and I'm hoping that if we can spend a little time on that, people might be really surprised at what this can come to mean in their life and what it was, I think, always meant to be for them. So I just think it's going to be interesting maybe to have some conversation about this thing that we call Holy Communion.
Right.
It's called different things by different faith traditions. I know sometimes it's referred to as the Eucharist, which is a fancy word for the Thanksgiving. So it certainly is a meal of giving thanks and being thankful for what Jesus did. And so, you know, when it comes to communion, this is one of those places, one of those items, if you will, that different faith traditions can do very differently, and it may even mean something to them in a different way. So we're going to try to talk about some of those things, and you may have something that our listeners may have something they've been told about communion, and maybe even have a question about that. And if they do, they can always email us
at thetableofpeterpodcast@gmail.com.
Absolutely. So we'll try to throw that out there one more time before we're finished today, just to give everybody a chance to write it down. If you're like me, the first time I hear something, I never have pencil and paper, but just grab your pencil and paper or pause it, and then you'll be ready. So, talking about communion, I spent a lot of time on this. Our sermon yesterday, the reason I really threw everybody for a loop is the sermon yesterday was on the bread of life, which comes out of the 6th chapter of John. Jesus tells his disciples, he tells all the people actually standing around, and many of them not really understanding much about Jesus, but he tells them, I am the bread of life. And that caused a big stir because they were like, wait a minute. We know your parents.
Right.
We know your roots. We know where you came from. You can't make us believe that you came down from heaven. What? Because he also compares it to the manna that came down from heaven when the Hebrew people were being freed from slavery in Egypt, and they were wandering through the wilderness and crying out to God, thinking they're surely going to starve because they may be free, but they didn't have anything to eat.
Right.
This wilderness was barren and dry. Maybe they get 1 to 2 inches of rainfall a year.
Pretty much a desert.
Yes, it is absolutely a desert. When it says wilderness in the Bible, it means desert. And so they were wandering in this desert, and the time they wander is for 40 years. And so having been there, Chris, and seeing just how incapable this area that they had to cross between Egypt and getting to the promised land, how lifeless it is, I realized these people weren't just being whiny babies.
You stood on the soil.
Yes, they absolutely knew. The reality was there's no way this place can produce enough food for all these people. And so with their bellies grumbling, they knew they were in trouble. But the beauty of it is God provides. And the only way they were fed for those 40 years is because God provided. So it's really cool. We'll not take a lot of time on that, but Jesus in that scripture in John chapter 6, he does compare himself. He says he's the bread of life, just like their ancestors ate manna in the wilderness. They were nourished and God provided. So Jesus is actually that provision for life, eternal life. And so it's not just a physical filling, but a spiritual filling. And when he talks about the bread of life and he says, I am, one of his I am statements, it calls to mind this image of Holy Communion. And that's why the Spirit I felt really led yesterday that if we're going to talk about Jesus being the bread of life, and then Jesus institutes this supper, this Holy Communion, this meal for his followers, that we would break bread together yesterday. So that's why I had everybody in an uproar, if you will.
Right.
Go to church, get in an uproar about whether or not you're having communion more than once a month. It's kind of comical to me, a little bit, because we do get in a habit of doing things.
Right.
And at Trinity, our communion is done on the first Sunday of every month. So with yesterday being second Sunday, it was just funny to watch all the confusion. Right. But I love to keep everybody guessing. It's okay. Let's shake it up a little bit from time to time, Chris. We got to shake things up. But anyway, so I did want to talk to folks today, and let's talk about a couple of things about this meal that is celebrated, called communion. And so when we go back to the first, I would say, communion, or when it was actually instituted as a meal that we should remember and celebrate, you go back to what most people call the Last Supper. And they've even got paintings and pictures of this. So the Last Supper, it was right before Jesus was going to be, he was going to be taken by the authorities and tried and crucified. And so he has a meal with his disciples. And the purpose of that meal is it's a celebration and a meal. They were having a meal in probably every Jewish home because they were celebrating Passover. And Passover was a huge annual celebration and remembrance that all Jewish people did ever since, like, I guess the night before they left Egypt.
Right.
So the night before they left Egypt, the reason they called it Passover is God was going to send an angel of death.
And that's when they put the blood over the doors?
Yes, they put the blood of a lamb.
The lamb, yeah.
Think about that connection, Chris.
Right.
The blood of the lamb over the doorpost. And when that was done, the angel of death would pass over the house, and everybody there would be saved from death. And so they would remember every year. It was a huge deal, and it's still celebrated to this day. But Passover, this remembrance that they were saved from death, and that it was the Last Supper for the Hebrews in Egypt. And they were then freed that next day. They were allowed to leave, and Moses led them out of Egypt. So they were free. And that is celebrated. And that's what they were doing. They were having that Passover meal. But at the Passover meal that they'd always celebrated, Jesus gives them, he says, a new commandment. Now, see if you find the new in this. I've got to share this with you because I love to point out the new, or what I think is new. He says, a new command I give you, that you should love one another as I have loved you. Now, what's new about that? I think that's interesting that he makes this important as part of the Passover meal, as part of the institution of the Lord's Supper or Holy Communion. So the new part, see, we've heard time and time again. I mean, in the Old Testament, it says, love your neighbor as yourself. And we've heard that, and Jesus repeats that we're to love one another, we're to love our neighbor. But the new part to me, that what stands out to me, is that we are to love one another the way Christ has loved us. Now that is a whole different level of love, don't you think?
Yeah, I agree.
Like, that is a sacrificial kind of love. And so when he speaks of this new commandment, he's introducing this radical, selfless, self-giving love. And he tells them, in telling them this new commandment, that he also gives them a command that they should eat the bread and they should drink from the cup, and that every time they do it, they are to do it in remembrance of him.
So that's why we got to keep doing it.
So that's why we keep doing it, yes. Jesus commands it. He explicitly commands his followers, his disciples, to partake, to do this in remembrance of me. And that's out of Luke chapter 22. So it is a command, and if Jesus says we should do it, I think most of us would get on board, right? Like, let's do it. Sometimes it's hard to figure out what to do, but I like it when it's not hard to figure it out. I like it when it's plain and
black
clear.
And white.
Yes. I like it when it's just, do this. And so we definitely, I feel like, are commanded, called, given everything we need to know so that we can do this in remembrance of him. Do this in remembrance of that kind of love, of that deep, self-giving, sacrificial, unconditional love. And every time that we take communion, we are reminded about Jesus and his death and resurrection on the cross, that his body, he says, broken for you, my blood given for you, so poured out for you. We do this, Chris, because, and I'll just tell you, I can't take credit for all these thoughts. I need to back up for a minute and just tell you that in my